Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Burnettwork, and welcome to PGS Moving Image. I am your host, Rrr Mmmm, and today we have with us Catherine Cooke and Kamran Pasha to discuss the Blade Runner cinematic legacy. That's right, guys, PGS Moving Image. We're going to talk about what we love about this film, thought-provoking questions, and so much more. Catherine, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Kamran, the same to you. Hope both of you are well. And I've been so excited. I've been wanting to talk about Blade Runner. Catherine, when you did your show, Cat's Corner, Blade Runner was one of the films that you picked as one of your essential films. And, I think for many of us who have been influenced by some incredible science fiction fantasy films, Blade Runner is definitely up there at top of the list. We're going to be talking about two films, more or less, the 82 version, which I'm going to call 82, and the most recent one, which I'm going to call 49 because it was 2049. Okay. So, it's interesting talking about Blade Runner, and I'm sure both of you remember the first time that you ever saw Blade Runner. It comes off very interesting. And the story is essentially a post-apocalyptic setting in a dystopian urban environment. And it actually is a fantastic story. But I could never get over how interesting and it just kind of pulls you in very seductively. The film is a neo-noir. I think it's very, very special. In your own words, Catherine, how would you describe Blade Runner genre, let's say, and has it evolved from 82 to 49?
It did evolve a lot between 82 to 49. I think that, iconically, it's like, you have the steampunk, mishmash of stuff that you've already seen in the 70s that they're putting in here. I like that right up front, they basically tell you what's what. And it's like, okay, so Roy Batty and the replicants are the good guys. Got it. And I'm watching this, and it's like, I wasn't sure if it was initially a joke or not that, Deckard is not a very good Blade Runner. He's kind of alcoholic, washed up guy. He can't shoot straight. And at first I was wondering, I wonder where they're going with this. Because I was aware of the legacy and everything of this movie long before I actually saw it. And so I'm watching it. I'm like, this is an interesting kind of journey because he's not a very, protagonist-wise, he's not a very likable guy. And it's interesting to see how these replicants, they have feelings. They're able to form lasting relationships. And I love the use of imagery. Like, they do everything in the lighting and the blocking to make Roy Batty seem very demonic, even though he's got the bleached hair, the dark suit, like his little angel halo. And then they do the reverse with Tyrell, who's wearing all white, but has the jet black hair of the devil halo type stuff. And it's like, okay, I can see where you're going with this. But I do admit that I thought Roy Batty was a much more compelling character, and I wish the film spent more time with him. But I liked the way that it doesn't over-explain things to the audience. It's not like holding your hand. It's not trying to dumb it down for you. It's like you could piece this together and see what this movie is really about on your own volition. Like, we're not going to talk down to our audience. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent description. And Kamran, I'm asking you the same question, and I would like you to also elaborate on something you were telling me a few minutes ago about having the privilege of being at a panel where you heard some very interesting information about Blade Runner.
Great. So I don't actually recall when I saw Blade Runner the first time. I've seen it so many times, right? So I don't remember when I saw it, but every time you see it, you find something new in it. It's one of those movies, right? You're like, oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't notice that. And then there's new. I mean, it's got that power of it. And I'll talk in a moment about why it's been so meaningful to me. But I will share what I shared with both of you just before we went live, which is that I did have the great privilege of just in 2019, because if I recall, the movie was set in 2019 and it was done in 82. And so in 2019, they did a special 39th year, 40th year anniversary screening in Los Angeles at the Directors Guild of America. Just before the pandemic, so people were still coming there, no masks, it was just normal. And Ridley Scott spoke at the end of the screening. And I've never been in a room with Ridley Scott, and so it was really amazing to have him up there, and he gave his very, very strong opinions about what the movie means. But what's interesting about this movie is that it is, because of what you've talked about, that it doesn't explain everything. It gives the audience freedom to interpret. As a result, many of the interpretations that have taken hold in the fandom were quite the opposite of what Ridley Scott intended, and he talked about that, right? But that's the joy of art, is that it doesn't matter. Ridley Scott has these opinions about what the movie is. Great. Doesn't matter. I have my opinions. Van Gogh had certain intentions when he painted Starry Night, but what matters is what I'm getting out of it, right? What meanings I make. That's the power of art. I mean, I'm a novelist and a screenwriter, and people tell me all kinds of things they find in my work that I did not intend, or maybe even the opposite of what I intended, but it was meaningful to them. That's all art is. Art is a conversation. And it's about subjective. So yes, for me, the meaningfulness of it, why it stays with me, is that it's ultimately the question of what is it to be human, right? And we've had a lot of these movies going, the Terminator that deals with this. I mean, it's a very archetypal science fiction thing about artificial intelligence, which is essentially what the replicants are. They're a form of android. They seem more organic than a lot of androids, but they are manufactured beings, and yet in many ways opposite to our greatest fears of AI is that they become more human than human. They have these deep feelings. They have these profound subjective things. And you have the great moments of they can appreciate art. They can appreciate the glories of the galaxy that they saw, that human beings can't go into those physical environments and see those things, right? And that's a whole level of sophistication. But what the movie is about is our fear of that new life. Normally it's about this Terminator is coming to wipe you out, right? Here we're coming to wipe the Terminator out, and really hasn't done anything wrong, except that it's outlived its usefulness, and we see it as a threat. And so we are, in many ways, human beings are the villains. And I'm sort of getting on a spiel here, but the reason I think that we have this trope of the fear of android and the fear of artificial intelligence is because of a deep ancestral human race memory in our DNA. That we shared the planet with other human beings and we wiped them out. The Neanderthals, they were human. They were fellow humans. We could reproduce with them. They were just another branch of our species. And we took them out. They don't exist anymore except for some DNA remnants of the people that they reproduce with. They're gone, and we wiped them out. And I personally have always believed that the symbolic meaning of the Abel and Cain story, I mean, some people believe it's literal, but let the symbolic religious meaning of it is, two brothers, one is peaceful and the other just kills him out of jealousy or to take what is his. And I think that symbolic meaning relates to that deep race memory we have of wiping out our brother human beings. And so our greatest fear is that that's going to be done to us. And this movie explores that in a more sophisticated way that maybe suggests, just like the Abel and Cain, maybe we're the Cain of the story. These people, these replicants just want to be left alone. They want to live.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And I think certainly something for all of us to contemplate about the role of these characters. And I also want to mention that the Deckard character is one of the most highly debated characters as to how is he defined, who is he, what is he. I think that I've probably seen hundreds of pages of people talking about whether or not Deckard is a replicant. And I thought that was, a different approach to kind of take, rather than ask the question, is Deckard human or a replicant? I propose the question, are any of the behaviors that Deckard exhibits exclusive to humans and or replicants? And is the idea of trying to classify him as one or the other futile? Does it change the story in any way? Catherine, what do you think?
Well, no, I don't think it changes the story, because let's say if he is a replicant and he's unaware of it, he still has a level of usefulness for them, which is why they're using him to get rid of the ones which are no longer useful. On the flip side, he's shown not to have any of the abilities of the replicants in terms of the fortitude and the physical peakness, all that kind of stuff. But as far as traits, well, not really, because in this movie, the only replicants we really get to spend time with are the ones who are just trying to extend their lives, have the right to live, and we don't really get to meet any of the replicants who don't have those concerns. Like, well, what do you do in your daily life when you're, because eventually the work clock ends, and you go, like, what do you do in your spare time type of stuff. We don't really get that like we get in 2049. And so with this, it's like, as far as Deckard expressing anything unique, well, not really, because we see that Roy and Pri are in a relationship. They love each other, and they're both replicants, and that's not an issue for them. We could see that Roy also has feelings of vengeance at times when he's going to confront his maker and the people who support the tyranny of the Tyrell Corporation, much like we see with with Deckard and the way he treats Rachel when she comes to his apartment, and just how annoyed and callous he kind of is, that he's just basically going around killing these people just because, oh, it's my job and I've been called in to do it. And it's like, well, do you even care about why they want you to do it? No, he's just going to do it. And granted, that's part of his character arc, having to realize to become, a better person. But that's the question: is being a better person qualify you as human or not? Because we've seen humans look throughout history, all the horrible things they've done to each other. And so I don't think there's necessarily anything uniquely human about one or the other. And to be, if that's what you were going off of to try and judge, well, is he or isn't he? And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether he is or not. Because like when you see at the end of the film and he, finds the organ, what matters is the idea was planted in his head. Like Roy Batty has changed his perspective on his life and what really matters and what he's been doing with his life and moralistically what his whole life and his livelihood has been about. And now he's thinking, oh, wow, it's like my entire understanding of being has been challenged by this. But the answer is never really concretely given in the first one because it doesn't really matter. Now, we know really how Ridley Scott feels about it. He feels very strongly that, oh, he's definitely a replicant. That's the whole point of the movie, blah, blah. Whereas Denis Villeneuve took the opposite point and said, well, no, he's human. But then we see with, Officer K, the Ryan Gosling character, they tell you right up front he's a replicant. It's no secret. But he also gets his own shocking revelation about his own life and what it means to be a replicant versus whether
no spoilers. I haven't watched it yet.
So I'm not going to specify what it is. I'm not going to spoil that for you. But it's the similar. Both films deal with those types of questions. But yeah, as far as I know, that there's, for all the discourse out there about is he or isn't he, in a sense, I feel that's kind of missing the point. Kind of like when people keep bugging Christopher Nolan about, well, did the top stop spinning at the end of Inception? It's like, that's not the point. He got back to what he wanted, and he doesn't care whether it's a dream anymore. The same way his wife was at the beginning of the story. So it's like, if you had just accepted that, you would have had your happiness still. Instead, you decided to ruin that, but now you're back at square. And it kind of feels like that with Deckard in a way. I don't get caught up in that whole, debate about is he or isn't he, because of what, again, all the talking points I just raised about what these movies are more or less thematically and philosophically about.
Cameron, what are your thoughts on the same question? Is the idea of trying to classify Deckard as a replicant futile, and does it change the story in any way?
Well, I was present when Ridley Scott gave his talk, and he was very adamant in the talk that he's obvious it's a replicant. Why can't you all see that? I thought I put so many clues in there. And we saw his director's cut of this, and I don't recall if this was in some of the other cuts that were broadcast. It might have been cut out because to lead to this controversy. In the director's cut that he showed, the original special effects were whenever the replicants were in the dark, their eyes glowed kind of yellow. There was a yellowish tinge, right? Mm-hmm. And that there's a moment where Deckard is talking and he steps into a shadow and his eyes glow a yellowish tinge. He's like, well, put it in there, right? So you'd all see this, right? But it doesn't matter because the subjective thing is how we perceive it. But what is interesting to me is, what does the question mean for the other characters? Okay, because if he is let's go with if he is a replicant, it changes a lot of the dynamics of how people are behaving, right? Especially the final moment where Rutger Hauer spares him. He's falling to his death and he grabs his hand. I assume the replicants can recognize each other, right? And him sparing him is sparing a brother. He knows this guy doesn't know. He's not programmed to know who he is, right? But he knows because he can sense him. He's like, this is one of us. This is, I am going to die in a few minutes. My clock is ticking down. But let me at least share some wisdom, like the old mentor, to this guy, and maybe I can wake him up from his programming. That suddenly changes his character and gives a whole different inflection to that final moment. Now, if the final moment is he is not a replicant, then the final moment is just that he shows that he is more compassionate than his human creators, right? That action is the legacy he's going to live, is that you've made me, and you've made me out in your minds to be a monster. And by this action of mercy, I'm going to show that I am not a monster. And maybe that will affect how you're going to treat people of my being in the future. They have different meanings, different character interpretations based on whether he is or he is not. And both are valid interpretations, but how you choose to perceive it is going to change how you see what people are doing. If he is a replicant, then all the people from the corporation and others around him, these are, I mean, these are already nasty people because they've hired a guy to take out, you know, at least apparently sentient forms, right? Or at least, you know, and that's bad enough of itself. But then you're going into real Dr. Mengele type of psychological torture to create a replicant to hunt other replicants, right? That shows a whole other layer of evil. And we've already shown how the lack of, you know, the cruelty of Rachel not knowing that she's a replicant, but he just tells Deckard that she's a replicant, right? And then Deckard cruelly tells her, right? And that there's that wonderful moment, you know, where that one tear comes on her eyes is her whole life, the memory she had, her family, none of it's real. Could you imagine how any of us would be told, you know, we're all talking about this is all a matrix. How would we actually face the fact none of your memories are not real? None of this ever happened. All right. Your love that you experienced, your childhood, it's not there. These people aren't real. These are photoshopped images. There was no mother there that loved you, right? It's overwhelming. And the cruelty with which they show it is. So this is, and if he is a replicant, it's the cycle of abuse now. He's being shown a certain level of cruelty. He's a replicant programmed to kill other replicants, right? And then he shares that cruelty with her. And then, but that cycle of cruelty ends when his life is spared, right? It gives a whole different meaning to it. They both are valid meanings. And I think the way you approach it is about your paradigm of the nature of life and consciousness. And they're valid, whatever your paradigm is.
Yeah, very interesting and insightful. And another kind of interesting thing about the 82 Blade Runner film is that when the film starts off, you have, you know, you're kind of looking into someone's eye. It's a fantastic point of view for the movie. And it looks like fire, but then you notice that the person is just focusing on what looks like an industrial city. But for most of us who know a lot about the background of Blade Runner know that it's a devastated Earth. It's after a nuclear war. You know, the Earth is in bad shape. However, the scenes of what the city looks like are mesmerizing. The cars that are flying around, you know, they almost have a gentle touch and a gentle flow to them, more gentle than maybe even like a bird, you know, flying through the sky. Even the lighting, while, you know, it's oftentimes in the scenes it's raining and, you know, they do these fantastic effects where the light I can't even describe it. It's like a halo as it goes past you. And it's very gentle, almost soothing. Even scenes where we see light coming through the window, it's also very soothing. Is it strange that it's so mesmerizing and haunting and maybe even, you know, hypnotizing, but the planet is destroyed? What do you think about the fact that it is about a destroyed planet, but it has this incredible scape that is, you really want to go to the city and see what it's like to be there in a sense? Catherine?
Well, yeah, it's like, you know, and you see that even in part 2, you get to see more of how destroyed things are when you get to venture outside of Los Angeles. And with the seawall, with the rising sea levels that have been out of control. And it is interesting to see that in both movies, really, that because in the first one, they're not as clear about how destroyed the rest of the world is because it just stays entirely in Los Angeles. Whereas the sequel, they show you more of it. And it's like, wow, for all of the advancements of the Tyrell Corporation in 82 and the Wallace Corporation in 49, they don't seem to be really applying any of that to help the rest of the Earth, which has apparently been dying off, or trying to fix any of that. They're more concerned with their own. In the first one, it's like Tyrell is obviously egotistical because he's very excited at the idea that when Deckard asks, how could she not know what she is? And he's so excited that he created a replicant that doesn't know what it is. And yet in the sequel, you also have a guy running Wallace Corp with a god complex as well. The idea that you can create something like this. And it's like, well, it sort of goes back to that line that Malcolm says in Jurassic Park, right? They were so preoccupied with whether or not they could do it, they didn't stop to think if they should do it. And so so I couldn't help but thinking in both movies, it's like you're in a dystopic society. Everything outside of the city has apparently been breaking down and is horrible, but you're not using any of this amazing tech or these replicants or anything to better humanity or better society. Like, it seems a bit, as interesting as it would look like to go exploring there, maybe, I don't know if I'd want to live there, particularly in I mean, yes, it looks nicer in 2049 because it's modern, better cameras and lenses, so it just looks all the more gorgeous when you're looking at it than the 82 version. But even watching what Deckard's day-to-day life is, it just like, and how his existence, his apartment and things, like, I don't know if I'd really want to go live in this place. Whereas you see the pyramid type palace that Tyrell lives in, and is again clear-cut symbols of good and evil. Like, okay, this is 80s corporate villain at its at its best and most decadent. So yeah, the way that both films are commenting on things like climate change, the fact that humans have basically destroyed the world, and now they've created this race of android slaves basically to serve their every whim and will. It's like, man, it's like, the way he visualizes it is done very well. But it's definitely not a place I would want to be stuck in living.
So, I mean, that's wonderful insight. May I now give a perspective? I don't think I've ever heard anyone say this perspective. I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure maybe, people have written about it if we look at it. But, looking at the original film and, and this hyper stylized, mechanized, beautiful world with all, kind of reminds you of Tokyo, right? Kind of reminds you of Tokyo, maybe Tokyo a few years from now, more than Los Angeles. And if we think about it, what is Japan? Japan is the only country with the misfortune of having suffered through 2 nuclear attacks, right? And, complete devastation of its many thousand-year historical tradition and having to rebuild, and a proud nation that is used to being an independent or conqueror suddenly having the humiliation of occupation, right? That has devastated Japanese culture over the decades. I mean, now we're having a problem, where society, they're not reproducing, right? And maybe talking 100 years from now, will there be Japanese people anymore, right? It's a real question. And I think that's a direct result of the trauma of World War II and the nuclear bombings. And so we also remember when this movie comes out, early 80s, Japan was very much in everyone's mind, if you think about it, in the 80s, right? It was seen at the time, sort of the rising nationalism of the Reagan days. A lot of people viewed Japan as a threat, right? That it was just they're replacing Ford and Chevy and all that. They're replacing GM. You're all buying Japanese cars, and I think there is a subtle commentary there. I don't even know if it was conscious. It was perhaps just osmosis from the environment of the early 80s, that there's a commentary on Japan as one direction human beings can go into, because after the nuclear bombings, Japan has become one of the most technologically advanced societies in the world. They are doing advanced robotics. They are doing, I mean, if anyone's going to figure out the, replicants, it's going to be the Japanese, right? They're going to get there first, right? And so when a society has been devastated by technology, you have 2 choices. You can either become, resist technology, go backwards like Planet of the Apes, right? Or we talked about Planet of the Apes last time. Right? Go look Planet of the Apes. Or you can completely embrace it. But then what do you sacrifice? Because Japan is this interesting combination of this very ancient tradition and culture, which is quite remarkable, living side to side by, it's like you go to Japan, you're suddenly either 300 years in the past, you turn the corner, you're 100 years into the future. There's stuff going on there that it takes another 20 years to catch up to in the West, right? Of how people do things. And at the same time, it is a society that is not reproducing. There is a sense of malaise there. There is a loss there, where a society that's lost its natural historical development and is trying to leap forward almost to forget the past of what happened to it. I think those themes are there in Blade Runner, and I'm sure if I Googled, or maybe there's scholarly theories on this, it just came to me as we were talking, that because I had never really considered the environment, and then I saw the analogy and that all came to me. I think there's something there.
Yeah, that is very interesting, Cameron. Which leads me to my next question. The replicants are challenging humans about their existence and deserving a place or a future, and yet they are still enslaved and kept down. Why does the evolution of replicants seem natural to the observer and, let's say, the corporation, but feels like a threat to humans on Earth in the future, in this film, and let's say in the next film? What do you think, Catherine?
Well, it's a threat because they're really no different from humans. In the first one, other than the fact that they have expiration dates and can otherwise die, but they do everything for them pretty much. we see what the replicants are employed for on Earth versus what we're told they're employed for off-world. And we see that basically continuing in 2049, even though it's a different model replicant that lives longer, but it's still the same thing. You're still serving, you're still serving humans and doing, and they seem to have a little bit more autonomy in 2049 than they do in the 2019 original. So that's much like Officer Joshi or Sergeant Joshi or whatever in the sequel mentions. It's like there are these two societies, and they're getting too similar to each other, that you're getting near to the breaking point. And that's why, like, people are afraid of the unknown, or they're afraid of something that's more powerful than them. They want to put it down, that kind of thing. And yes, racing towards technology, especially with the replicants evolving, the tech has evolved to be exactly, wow, it's that advanced. And to your point about, how much the Japanese have advanced, they were actually among the first to create AI robotics. That one of the first things the robots did was break their binary language code to invent their own language so that the programmers couldn't tell what they were talking about, and then working together to try and open the door of the room that they were in. And it was like, wow, that is really, we talk about wildly advanced technology. People right now in like Hollywood are worried about AI being used to write scripts, which is just, searching the internet and rewriting keywords and stuff. But that's not anything like the AI of what you've seen in some of these robotics that have been done, particularly in Japan. And I think part of the reason Japan is technologically advanced as it is, same with Germany and other parts of Europe, because they had a quasi way of saying it, the benefit of having to rebuild, whereas most of America's entire cities and transportation systems is still based around mid-19th century technology. Like in that century since then, when Europe had to rebuild from the rubble, Japan had to rebuild from the rubble, and so they didn't really have much of a choice. So they took what was there and they just ran with it. And that's kind of the societies that you're seeing have been evolving from it. Like, I'm shocked when looking at some of these small islands in the Pacific, like say Tarawa, when you look at how overbuilt some of these places are, but how tech savvy a lot of it is. It's like, man, that's really, it's like you're starting over again, seeing what we're seeing in the LA of the Blade Runner world. This is heavily advanced, and it makes you wonder, since they haven't really, I mean, they did allude to in the short films that were, prequels to 2049, that there probably was a rebellion or something a long time ago that led to the LA of the original Blade Runner. But yeah, so it's that thing. If they're too much like humans and they're outnumbering you, they're doing everything that you're doing, and they know they've learned all your skills, then what's to stop them from really, breaking free of that? Because we saw in the original movie, it's only Roy Batty and a few replicants. They're not able to really recruit other replicants on Earth. They just had to travel there from across the cosmos. But 2049, it's a much different environment for them.
And Cameron, what are your thoughts? Why are humans pushing back against the evolution of replicants?
Well, it goes back to my initial comment about Abel and Cain. It is our original sin of at least to each other. I mean, if one takes the original sin of man rebelling against God, then it's man rebelling against his brother, right? And it is the thing that haunts us. It is our greatest fear of being replaced. As you know, I'm from the Muslim spiritual tradition, and in the Quran there is actually a verse in the Quran where God, because the Quran is presented as God's speech, so God is quoted, and God says to human beings who are sinful, he says, and it's talking about all of humanity. To all of humanity. God speaks in the plural here, the royal we. We can destroy you, all of you, and replace you with a new race. We don't need human beings. I mean, you think you're so almighty, right? We can replace the human race, and that's easy for us, right? And so that's an idea that's very resonant for people. That the human race is not necessarily the final step of creation, right? And that is something that is deep within our hearts, our greatest fear, because of our ego, of our belief in our, superiority, in our mastery of the material world. The idea that we could be replaced is deeply primordial, and yet at the same time, we have this man being created in the image of his creator, using those terms, and we human beings, and as a result, we are attempting to do that. I mean, we don't have to create AI. There's no gun to our heads that we need to develop this technology, right? This is a choice. Right? We don't need to do these stuff, right? And we are entering an era, which you can think in the Aquarius age, the age of Aquarius. Aquarius in the astrological world represents science it represents humanity, it represents the future, all of those things. But the dark side of Aquarius, because each sign has a light side and a dark side, the dark side of Aquarius is the abuse of all those things. It's the abuse of signs. Aquarius is seen as the rational sign that's disconnected from emotions. Well, that can be very bad because, Dr. Mengele was a rational, brilliant scientist disconnected from its emotions. So he could torture people, right? He could do these horrific experiments on people because he was not emotionally connected to them, right? And I think we're reaching a pivotal stage where a lot of us are questioning the pharmaceutical world and questioning a lot of the technology that's being presented to us as the future. We're like, well, I don't want this. I don't think this is going to make us better, right? We just had human beings. There was an announcement that they're making synthetic embryos. For a lot of us, that's very troubling. If you manage to create life at the embryonic level, what happens to that life when it becomes aware? It's not human the way we are. And if it has human consciousness, or at least consciousness, will it see us as the way children see their parents? Oh, these old stupid people, right? Except will it then grow to become our greatest enemy, right? I'm not personally a big fan of this kind of experimentation, both on genetics and on AI. I'm not a fan of these things. I think that we are unleashing forces we do not understand, and I think that a movie like Blade Runner taps into, like all these movies have, the threat of it. But what's interesting about Blade Runner is that there's an acknowledgement of the threat of this new race. So you put a time limit on it. You put an expiry date, right? But, a lot can be done within the expiry date. And what if these things can figure out how to extend their expiry date, right? All of these things, right? And so it's not like, the danger of the human condition is we think we're a lot smarter than we are. And we think that we can control the universe with our intellect. And we just can't. And I think the last 3 years showed that. A lot of smart people mishandled a lot of things because they thought they could control the entire universe and the human race and make it do certain things for its own safety or whatever they thought. It didn't work out the way they wanted. And so these are the deepest fears of that element of the human condition, which is where our own intellect becomes our adversary.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And, this is a neo-noir film. That's one of my favorite genres. And right away, I remember the first time I ever even saw the poster of Blade Runner, you see this picture of a woman. And of course, it's Sean Young who plays the main character, Rachel, who is the focus. And she is a femme fatale, for all practical purposes. At least I see her as a femme fatale. And she's a designed femme fatale. So, a normal femme fatale, let's say a human femme fatale, has certain characteristics, but a designed femme fatale, this designed femme fatale can have many abilities that we haven't seen before in real life in a particular genre. And I think that Rachel distinguishes herself. I'm not going to say what she does in 2049 because you haven't seen it yet, Cameron, but
does Sean Young return for 2049?
I don't want to say what happened.
Don't
I don't want to spoil it because
don't spoil it. Don't spoil it. That's probably intrigued me even more. So yeah.
Let's just say that
character in some role intrigues me.
Yes. Let's just say that something happens in 2049. We learn a little bit more about her. We know that in 82, let's say from the cinematic, because I'm not necessarily going to talk about the book. This is all about how the films have impacted us. And, honestly, the execution of these films and the stories, let's say, told within them, which may not necessarily follow everything in the book, right? So, but in the film, we learn from Tyrell that Rachel is an experiment. She's special. And it's true, she is. My question is, if you're going to have a femme fatale in a story and she's designed, what abilities do you think they could have put with her that could distinguish her from the other replicants? Should this have been explored in the first film, let's say, because there are certain characteristics for all femme fatales. And Rachel seems a little different from a lot of the femme fatales I've seen, and watching all the different film noirs I've seen. What are your thoughts, Catherine?
Well, she's not so much a femme fatale. She doesn't really turn against the hero, doesn't really sabotage anything. She's just, and as Tyrell says, the whole point, the reason he wanted Deckard to give her the test, because he wanted to show off just how cool it is. Hey, look what I did. I created something which, like, how does it not know what it is? And he's excited at the idea that he's managed to create that. That's something that literally can't know what it is, and they dive into that a lot more in 2049 in terms of the process of how he actually did that, even though it's a new corporation this time. And so yes, it's her going, the fact that she does rush to Deckard and ask for his help, because she was able to also see something that, Tyrell was like, this guy clearly isn't just here to Mars test, like, what's this about? So she goes to his house, and even after he shatters her whole world view, and Tyrell decides, well, you've outlived your usefulness, because that was your purpose, was to not know. So he puts the hit on her, but she goes back to Deckard anyway, because she could tell that even he was intrigued by this aspect, and she didn't literally have anywhere else to go. At which point it sort of becomes, it becomes like going after, the Roy Batty show as such. But as far as the benefit, I mean, I could see the benefit from Tyrell's perspective, obviously, of a replicant not knowing what it is. You don't have to have that issue anymore of them necessarily being aware that they're a slave race, because if you could trick them into thinking they're people like everybody else, then you're going to use basically the class system. Oh, you're impoverished, you're going to be working all these types of jobs that nobody likes, try and move your way up the ladder, you're not going to, blah, blah, blah. All of that would be much simpler for him in terms of control, whereas in 2049, the fact that most of the replicants living there, they do know that they're replicants. That's the whole issue that Sergeant Joshi is talking about. It's like we're at an equivalent base here between humans and replicants. It's getting to the point where it doesn't really matter what is what, and except for one other little thing. I'm not spoiling what it is, but there's one other little difference. And if the replicants achieve what that difference is, then it's endgame. It's over for humans.
Well, I won't say it out loud, but I have a guess as to what that difference could be, and that would be the end game. So I think I know where that's going, but that's fine. I'll watch it and find out. And I agree with you. She's not really a femme fatale. It's about, again, how we define the word. What are the aspects of that? For me, because I've written novels with femme fatales, right? And my novel on the Crusades, Shadow of the Swords, has a femme fatale very much at the center. She's a spy in the middle of the Crusades. As a woman is a spy in the middle of the Crusades. And I love femme fatales. I mean, actually, the very first poem that I ever wrote in my aspiring poetry days was entitled Femme Fatale, right? And I've dated a few femme fatales. It's kind of in my gene. But one of the things that a femme fatale is linked to is, when we use the word fatale, let's think about and I forgive my pronunciation in French, but the petite mort, right? There's a sexuality to it, right? There's this the concept. The reason that they're so fatale, that they're so dangerous, is that their sexuality is a weapon, right? It is a weapon to that men easily fall for, and women and others, whoever the femme fatale is using their power on, that is, even if there's no sex involved, there's always the sensuality, the seduction, the manipulation that causes the eroticism of the other side, that takes away their reason, right? And I don't really see Rachel's character doing that in the first movie. She seems more vulnerable. She seems more someone that actually reflects the humanity, and interesting enough, because she's a replicant, a known replicant, that reflects the humanity that Deckard has lost and maybe never had if he was a replicant, but allows him, the whole arc is at the end he leaves with her, right? It allows him to regain humanity, or in the case of replicant, to become human through this replicant that is programmed to be human, right? So in that way, I think it's in many ways the opposite. It's almost like an angelic figure. We have the concept of the virgin whore, right? Because it reflects, male psychology, because the virgin represents how we see our mother. The whore represents we've had a bad experience in a relationship, and suddenly have ugly perceptions of women that are not fair, right? But because we projected onto them the mother figure, and then they became their own independent self, and then we project onto the other extreme figure. That's the psychology of the duality there, of where that range comes from. And so in some ways she plays the Virgin Mary role in some ways for this, right? Whereas the femme fatale, I think, is more like the Mary Magdalene character, right? Even if she is redeemed, it is the character and why she erased until really the 20th century. Why does she really fall out of favor in much of the Christian tradition? Is because even though it's not clear that she is the prostitute that is referenced in the Gospels, she was amalgamated with that character, and so she was just perceived as sexually threatening. Because if you had a perception of Jesus as a non-sexual being, right? Then you have this figure that's very clearly very intimate to him. You know, some of the Gnostic Gospels say he used to kiss her on the lips. These are like second century Gospels, right? He said that, you know, he loved her more than the disciples. So clearly it's a very early tradition of Christianity that Mary Magdalene was special and had a special relationship with Jesus that troubled the people around them, right? And so she becomes a femme fatale. And again, it's her sexuality. It's the fact that she isn't the virginal mother. She could potentially be a romantic or sexual partner for the Messiah, which is threatening to some interpretations. So that is where we go to. But you know, it's actually Daryl Hannah's character, I think, in some ways is a femme fatale, right? Because she's sexual, right? She's very clearly sexual. Her body, she moves it that way. She enjoys, and she toys with Deckard like cat and mouse, right? There's the interesting thing about it is that you feel grief when all of these replicants are killed. You feel grief about them because they're so human. In some ways, they're more archetypally human, right, than the human characters, and so you feel bad when she dies, right? Even though, you know, she's not necessarily shown. None of them are really shown as redeeming characters until you get to know them a little bit better. And her danger is that she's unafraid of being a sexy woman, even though she's a robot, right? So that's where the femme fatale is, I think, in the movie.
That is very interesting. I interpreted a lot of the relationship between Deckard and Rachel as Rachel's role was for Deckard to fall in love with her.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to have a relationship, a physical relationship.
Sure. And
this physical relationship could lead to many things, but she had to, let's say at some point in the film, she saves his life by using a weapon to protect her from another replicant. But the goal, unbeknownst to her, and perhaps because they fall in love with one another, the desire that she has as a replicant and just Deckard just has in general towards her overwhelms a lot of other things, so that they're literally sort of fighting for each other. But I was always under the impression, or after watching the film several times, I truly feel that Tyrell put Rachel and Deckard together on purpose. You know, he had an ulterior motive for this. And, you know, there is something very unique about Rachel. And so she was pretty much there to seduce him. But I don't think it was in necessarily a bad way. However, it put Deckard in an incredible amount of danger that he could have avoided. And he could have walked away, let's say, you know, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with how the story turned out. I like how the story turned out, but it was very dangerous. And for a while, it was very uncertain as to what was going to happen to either of them. We saw Rachel kind of, you know, saying that she couldn't come down and meet him. And then the next thing you know, she's literally following him. So there were a lot of things that were going on, at least from on her side, where she even kind of asks him questions like, I don't know whether I can play the piano. There's a lot of things she doesn't know about herself. However, as an observer, you know, she's following him and she has to make sure that she has more intimate encounters with him. So I kind of think that it's a very interesting character. However, I think that it's actually love that makes her follow him and make sure he's safe. So
well, it also depends on because again, like Tyrell said, is he telling the truth when he says that he put a head on her, or did he just trick her into doing that? Because if he did that, then that's not necessarily going to be conducive to them falling in love on the off chance that one of his assassins succeeds. Because it's like, if they succeed, that's like, well, then now the experiment's over with, you know? Hence why when you watch part 2, 2049, it's like, well, is the villain telling the truth about this or not? Is he simply trying to plant the idea in Deckard's head to try and reorient things? So that's kind of interesting that, you know, reading that question of who is human and who is replicant completely reorients your interpretation of each of the films, depending on which answer you go with. But or you just take it like me, and it's like, well, the philosophy of it is like, well, does it really matter? Which is kind of what the replicants' position is. Like, they don't care that they're replicants. Like, we have all the same abilities in you. We have the same emotional capacity as you. It's like we don't really want to be treated like this anymore. Like you said, you're creating an embryo or artificial intelligence. What happens when it becomes self-aware? You know, and so the replicants obviously don't care if people think they're human or not. They feel that they are, and they are what they are. It's like, there it is. So as far as what the intentions were of Tyrell versus carrying over to what Wallace suggests Tyrell's intentions were, it comes down to your reading of the film and how it plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, again, all of these characters, what their intentions are, whether they're lying, whether they're telling the truth, whether they're lying to themselves, it's all subjective. That's the genius of this film, is that it leaves these questions to be asked, rather than answering for you. And that's true craftsmanship. That here we are, 40 odd years later, talking about this movie, and there's no consensus, and yet we all love it.
Yeah, and the second film does the same thing. They don't talk down to you. They're like, here's what it is, and then depending on how you want to interpret is who's who or how they really feel about it, or who's telling the truth or not, you can get all sorts of readings out of it, which is why it was very well received among just sci-fi fans, even those who, I mean, yeah, it did suffer at the box office a bit because it was a bit over reliant on you having to see the first movie to really emotionally connect with what was going on, at least for certain aspects. And when you
and they didn't really they should have released the first movie again in some almost like a prequel to, let's set this up for this generation of these kids who don't know anything, right? I saw it in that special release in 2019, but they really needed to make that more of a widespread effort.
Yeah, because I remember that they kept saying in marketing that, oh, you don't have to see the original. It's like, well, yeah, you do. And you're sure, not for the basic plot and the concepts, but when you get to the third act, you really do, if you want to have any emotional connection or resonance to what the movie is really about. And so, yeah, that's kind of difficult. But then again, given the implications of where they were going to go with the third one, maybe I'm kind of happy that they didn't, because I don't think you really need a third. And you'll probably see what I mean if you watch the movie, and it's like, well, because not everything needs to be franchised to death. It's like they waited 35 years before they did another Blade Runner. I'm not really excited at the idea that Ridley Scott wants to do a series now. It's like
I don't know that that's going to come together. I think there's
maybe not. Hopefully not.
Look, I work primarily as a TV writer, and let's just say there's a lot of dreams that don't come true in television.
And there were a couple, 2 or 3 live action prequel shorts to the sequel that I would watch now that they're out there before you watch the movie. They were actually pretty good. And then an animated prequel as well. By prequels, they're like, they're before it, but they're like short films, and they're actually pretty good. But yeah, I love how these films it leaves it open to interpretation. They don't talk down to your audience. And as much as Denis Villeneuve and Ridley Scott are going to argue about it back and forth, because Denis Villeneuve feels very strongly that Deckard's a human, and he listed a whole litany of reasons as to why. And then Ridley Scott says, well, no, he's a replicant. Here's all the reasons as to why. And it's like, well, that's great, because neither of them are really wrong, because of the way the films are both presented. And that's what makes it so cool. And I think it's going to give the sequel as much staying power as the original.
And you both know I love romances. I love love stories. Like, as soon as I realized what was going to happen between Rachel and Deckard, like, my heart started pounding hard, because I had thought to myself, this is a science fiction movie, but they're falling in love. And that really, it really grabs me. And I thought to myself, when we look at this dystopian environment and all the troubles and everything, a love story comes out of it. And I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of it. I think made it a triumph for me. But romance and the desire for love is a theme that's in the 82 version as well as the 49 version. It never goes, you're not far away from it. And I think it's 2019 now, we've passed 2019, let's say. And we don't have replicants in our modern time, but a good portion of our society,
at least that we are aware of.
Exactly. At least we haven't, we don't all have our own replicants yet, but a good portion of our society use tech and avatars, which generate a sense of perfection and imagery that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
But in 49, there is a computerized virtual girlfriend for one of the replicants. It's not a spoiler, Cameron. I think you've heard about that.
Yeah, and I've heard of this, yes.
And, she's really one of the most interesting characters, I think, that they've created. But even I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But even I felt very disturbed by it. And I'm not quite sure why I was disturbed. I guess because I felt that she wasn't real. And this is something that I wondered to myself, what was your reaction? Now, Cameron, I know you haven't seen it, but Catherine, what was your reaction when you realized that one of the main characters had a girlfriend who is essentially virtual, a computer program? And did you think that relationship, I think it's real in the sense that he had emotions towards her and everything, but what are you think about it?
Okay, so it kind of, I'm surprised that this became as big of a talking point as it did when the movie came out, because again, in the first one, Roy and Pre are in a committed romantic relationship, and they're both androids, and nobody really questions it. Like, most of the dialogue around the original movie is Deckard a replicant or why, but they're not really talking about how you have two replicants who are madly in love with each other, and there's a romance, and it feels very human and real. And there's one line, it's kind of a throwaway line in the sequel, where Love says that this program, this holographic program that Officer K has, is the same CPU programming code as the replicants. So of course she could interact with him like he can interact with her. And it's kind of like that Spike Jonze movie, Her, where you have a character who's isolated, a bit antisocial, who starts building this relationship with a virtual Siri. And it's like, well, does it matter if it's real or not? It's like, well, I don't know. It's like, obviously you could see in this movie as well, it's real to him, much like in Her, it was real to him. He got what he needed out of it. Mm-hmm. And so it's like an emotional support type of thing. Like when somebody has an emotional support, granted, an animal is like a real living, breathing thing, but you're not obviously able to talk with it or connect with it the same way that you can with other people, right? But mm-hmm. It still brings you some emotional satisfaction in a good way in looking after it. And so does it really matter that Joy the hologram is a hologram? That, like, does it matter? It's like, how is that any different than Roy and Pre from the first movies? Like, yes, Roy and Pre are three-dimensional android robots, but they're in love with each other. Nobody questions it. It's fine. So is it a big deal that Officer K can feel the same way about something, the hologram? It's like, to me, well, not really, especially when you see, in a sense, how miserable Officer K's life is. And if you're using the same CPU, well, yeah, it's interacting with him. He's interacting back. And it's interesting how you see that relationship play out. And Ana de Armas is just fantastic in that role. It's one of my favorite parts of that movie. So yeah,
that's a movie that really broke her in the general public consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Because I think she's an absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely.
I saw Blonde. I'm a huge Marilyn Monroe fan. I actually live in Los Angeles. I go regularly to Monroe's grave to pay my respects. I go there probably every couple of weeks, right? She's not far from where I live, and I didn't think that movie was a good movie, but I thought her performance was phenomenal. It's probably the closest anyone has come to channeling Marilyn. So she's a very special actress.
Absolutely. And, then it's interesting to listen to both of your responses, because after a while, I questioned why I was so reluctant or resistant to seeing this. And then I realized that, a lot of the themes about love and attraction and the desire for intimacy, the desire for being with someone, those desires trump all of the rules that we're seeing in these stories. And mm-hmm. They're so strong, they're so dominant, perhaps maybe even the reason why many of these characters get up in the morning, because they're excited to see their partner or whoever they're going to have this interaction with. So, even Catherine Kay's boss, I think she kind of, looks at him more than just a subordinate in a sense, and
she clearly treats him as if he gets preferential treatment in a way. Like she treats him like he's the teacher's pet, even though he doesn't really act like it. He's completely loyal, and the way she interacts with him is kind of relaxed. Like, she's genuinely worried about the potential for a outright war between humans and replicants, but with Kay, she feels totally relaxed.
That is very true. And I think that it challenged me, and I wasn't expecting the second film to challenge my notion of a virtual individual. And that's what I'm calling him now, a virtual individual, a virtual entity. It is very real. And as you said, Cameron and Catherine, Ana de Armas made that character come to life. She was just stunning and amazing. And there's even a part, this is also not a spoiler, Cameron, where she gets some kind of technology where she's a virtual individual, but now she can move around in somewhat more unrestricted manner. And so then, here she's made a gain. It feels like a gain. It didn't matter whether she can move around or not, and then it even explores the desire for her to be intimate with her partner. And that is explored in another way, in a way that humans actually do what we saw. So I thought that was a very interesting approach, but it certainly did explain, or at least demonstrate to me, that they are in love with each other, as far as I can tell. And I said, this is the first thing that I saw in the first film that attracted me, and just my heart started pounding. And then when I realized how much she wanted to have an intimate experience with this person that she would do, you know, what she did in the film, I realized that it's no different. It's no different. Catherine, as you said, it's the same CPU, it's the same programming.
Well, yeah, and to piggyback off that further, it's the film poses the question: does it matter if the love was real or not? Because it's a program. It's like, well, to me, again, it doesn't matter, because if you're having an emotional connection with something, what does it matter? You might be a little upset and peeved that it's not real, but if you're getting that type of emotional satisfaction out of that, in much the same way that it's been said that when TVs were first invented, it was great for lonely people because you could just have something on in the background with people always talking, so you don't really feel as alone if you're cut off from society or whatever. Does it matter to them that you're watching something that's pixelated on a TV that isn't, like, yeah, you might be watching real people, but they're somewhere else in another time if it's pre-recorded and stuff. So, but does it matter to them that it's not real and they're not able to talk back to it immediately? No, they still get they obviously get some type of emotional satisfaction out of it. And so with, you know, the way Officer K interacts with Joy and what his thoughts are when the movie questions, well, does it matter that it's not real? It's like, well, to me, it doesn't. I don't get why it's such a big deal. Again, why people care if it's real or not. Because again, I always go back to the Roy and Pre example in the first one. And I know the first movie didn't spend a lot of time on the Roy and Pre relationship. It presents it as such a normal, natural thing that you'd be forgiven if you would forget that, oh yeah, that's right, they're not humans, they're replicants, you know? And so it's just kind of, it carries that on. Like, does it matter if this is real or not? Like, and like I said about Deckard being a replicant or not, it's like, well, does it matter if he is or if he isn't? The point is, at the end of the first movie, he's in a sense had a whole spiritual awakening, if you will. He's not the same vicious, callous guy that he was at the beginning of the film, and that's got to count for something, you know.
That is very true. And as we're nearing the end of this hour, I promise not to keep you both for an hour. And I would actually like both of you to come back after Cameron has seen the second film. Cameron,
I need to. I absolutely need to. And I wanted to see it before. I just wasn't able to. So it's all good. Okay,
so this will be part one. And Catherine, of course, I'm hoping that you can come back for the discussion for the second, let's say the second half of our Blade Runner Legacy cinematic IP discussion. What I was going to say is, are there any last thoughts? To be honest with you, you know, and I know we've had quite a lot of philosophical conversations about this film. I think the film is beautifully made, and it's seductive as you're watching it, and it's mesmerizing, and the colors are soothing, the lights are soothing. It's nothing jarring about it, and it really is almost hypnotic to me. So much of the film is like that. Even the fighting scenes where we see certain things happening, the shadows and the lighting in that is remarkable. So there's so much in it that I enjoy. And of course the performances of the actors. So anybody who hasn't seen it, I know Tom said he hasn't. Tom Jr. Jackson, who's the moderator tonight, says he hasn't seen that film in its entirety. Many of you watching this probably have seen the film, but please do go ahead and rewatch it. It's a remarkable film. And where I live in New York, at the Museum of the Moving Image, they have some of the original sets. You know, the Tyrell Tower is in the Museum of the Moving Image. So I've seen it about 100 times, you know, looking at this. And it's a model, of course, but it really is exciting to even see that. So much of this genre, they kind of started this cyberpunk genre, if you will, with this film. So, and it's just mesmerizing. I just wanted to get your final thoughts, Catherine, on Blade Runner 82.
I agree that it's a very niche thing. I admit I don't like it nearly as much as the sequel, because again, I find the Roy Batty character to be a lot more, I like his plight and find that really compelling. I want to spend more time with the replicant to learn more about them and stuff than through Batty, than Deckard, because Deckard is frankly kind of a jerk. And I get the whole readings of it, then yeah, you can get something else out of it. But the first one I feel is a great talking point, because it is, amassing all these different ideas together. Because it was based off, there were there were 3 or 4 original novels that Philip K. Dick wrote that they kind of cherry picked different ideas from it before making it. And the first one, I think, they did a good job at bringing that into the public consciousness in terms of bringing that stuff that you'd already seen as staples of the sci-fi genre in terms of the types of questions that science fiction has always been posing, and putting it in a movie which admittedly didn't have mainstream success, but certainly had staying power. Like, there are plenty of people out there who probably haven't seen Blade Runner, but they'll know what it is if you mention the name to them, which is, again, that's meaningful. It captured something. And Rutger Hauer's performance in particular just was so great and wonderfully done. So yeah, I think it's a great movie. I saw the final cut as well before the other ones. And so I'm not even sure if I've seen all the different cuts of the movie, but I kind of agree somewhat in the sentiment. If it's such a great movie, you shouldn't have. Why are there so many cuts of it? Like, make up your mind and put down the cut that you could, stick with. But so it's good. But I do like the sequel better, though. I find it to be more hypnotic and mesmerizing and just relaxing and much more of a wild, visual or whatnot experience.
That's fantastic. And Cameron, what are your final thoughts on Blade Runner the 82 version?
Well, I'm going to keep it very short and simple because I think so much has been said, that really just speaks for itself. For me, just as a filmmaker, as an artist, this is what art is capable of. This is what filmmaking is capable of. This is what I would aspire to leave behind something like this over the course of my work as a screenwriter, as a filmmaker, something that people are talking about many decades later, something that has multiple interpretations, something that actually really explores the nature of what it means to be human. There are very few films out there, honestly, that do that. And there's a reason we're talking about Blade Runner, because I think it is a rare moment in Hollywood history where all of these different pieces come together, and I think that's why it's so special.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Cameron and Catherine, for being here today. Catherine, where can people find you?
Find me on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter at Sly Snide. Find me on the Phantasmagorium Show YouTube channel. We got a lot of playlists of shows that I've done on there. Movie review shows of Tarantino, Rodriguez, Batman, Spider-Man. Now we're doing Indiana Jones. We did James Bond, of course, which is what we were mostly known for. And then I have a Star Wars show that streams every second and fourth Sunday of the month at 8 a.m. Pacific, called The Unifying Force, on the Virtual Cantina Network YouTube channel.
Excellent, guys. And here's the link to the Phantasmagorium channel. You can find Catherine there. You can also reach out to Catherine here at the Burnettwork as well. Cameron, where can people find you?
I think the best place to find me right now is my Patreon, which I will throw in a link into the chat before I leave. But that's where I talk a lot about my opinions on Hollywood. I share my screenwriting tips. I give my insights into industry things like the strike and things that are happening. And every now and then I get some interesting scoops and insider information from people working at the various studios and Lucasfilm and other places. And some of them are controversial because, contradicts some of the narratives that are in the fandom. But my people on the inside have certain perspectives that are perhaps different from where the fans think things are. So come see there, and RM, you've been a member for a while. The community we've created there. It's very open, a lot of different points of view. It's got a life of its own. There's a lot of people speaking there and sharing ideas. I'm reaching a stage in my Patreon where I'm now doing articles that are just reposts and analysis of comments by members that started a fascinating conversation that I never thought of, right? That's the level of community we've created there. So please come and join me there.
Absolutely, guys. Do check out Cameron on his Patreon. I'm just seeing if I can get I didn't see the link, but I managed to get it from from YouTube, I think. I'm just going to go ahead and put it here. It's Kamran Pasha, guys. If you look right here, I'm just going to highlight it, and it is in the chat here, everybody, on his Patreon. Guys, remember, Cameron created the Pasha method of writing. So if you're a writer, you want to start to learn how to write, check out Cameron on his Patreon, and this method will help you tremendously. I'm using it now, so I can't say enough about it. I just want to thank both of you, Catherine and Cameron, for joining me today. And I invite you both back for the second part, where we're going to be discussing in more detail Blade Runner 2049. And certainly there is a lot to talk about. And when it comes to this particular IP, I think it's been so fantastic. And what a wonderful discussion, both of you. Thank you so much for being here, guys. You can find me here on the Burnettwork or on Positive Fandom. And thank you, Tom Jr. Jackson, my moderator, collaborator, and good friend, who is here tonight. Please do subscribe to his channel as well. And I believe it is here. Guys, thank you, everybody in the chat, for showing up today. We will continue the conversation in the part 2 of the Blade Runner Cinematic Legacy. I want to thank everybody for being here today. And guys, remember, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody.